Hello. Well, most know about the Neil Ferguson situation by now, but I wanted to go through it because it's just too much fun not to. This is an article in The Guardian, and of course, they're more worried about the effect this is having on the scientists than the effect this is having on the people who are still in lockdown, which is, well, sort of typical of The Guardian. But it gives a good rundown here of what's going on. So I'm going to read a couple of things from this article and then I'll just riff off on my own. UK scientists being drawn into a very unpleasant political situation. Colleagues raised concerns after Professor Neil Ferguson stepped down from advisory role. And notice they use the word advisory because they want you to know that it's not really his fault what happened. Scientists who advise the government on its coronavirus strategy have warned they are being drawn into politics. Well, I'd like to know what scientists, but go on. After the leading infectious disease modeler, Professor Neil Ferguson, stepped down as one of the cabinet's most prominent advisors. Have you noticed how many times they use the word advisor here? You know, speaking as somebody who's basically a professional text analyst, it's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that they keep on using this word advisors, because they want you to remember that these people aren't giving the orders. They're just advisors. They're backroom boys. Yeah. So you remember that. Ferguson, the head of the Imperial College team, whose modelling persuaded ministers that Britain needed to order a lockdown to prevent hundreds of thousands of deaths, resigned from the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies on Tuesday night. We Brits are so good at thinking up names for committees, aren't we? SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. It sounds like something that Ian Fleming would have thought up for one of his shadowy organisations in a James Bond novel, don't you think? Anyway, Ferguson left the position after it emerged that his lover had visited his home on 2 occasions in March and April in a breach of the government's official guidance on social distancing. Now, I want you to notice that they actually used the correct word there, guidance. It's guidance. The police took it to mean law and applied it, but in many cases it was just guidance. That's another issue. One scientific advisor to the government, now this is a Guardian sloppy reporting again, scientific advisor to the government is not enough. Now, either this person wanted to remain anonymous, in which case they should have said that, or they should have given his name. But I have an idea that this is either slopping reporting, that is, the reporter forgot which person said what, or that there was a record of the names, but the person or the people, or 3 people who wrote this article, couldn't be asked to look up who said what. Anyway, one scientific advisor to the government said Ferguson's resignation had created an awful lot of concern and that the mood in the community was very depressed. Why was it depressed? It's, you get on with what you're doing and you do it. One of your number is not the whole thing. And are you depressed because you're worried about being caught? I hope not. The events revealed how University academics who lent their advice to government were having to cope with an increasingly difficult situation. The advisor, this unnamed person, added. He's an academic researcher. Right. This person wails at us. He's an academic researcher. He doesn't make decisions. He's not paid for any of this. We are being drawn into a political situation which is very unpleasant, they said. No, you're not. The guy is an advisor, didn't follow his own advice, and is now reaping the rewards for his activities. That's all. What is there to feel depressed about? Ferguson had become one of the most trusted voices on the outbreak and took a prime role in discussing the reasons for the lockdown and social distancing measures. But that prominence led to him being portrayed as a decision maker rather than an independent scientist. I didn't see that. He's an independent scientist. He was giving advice to the government, and the government was taking that advice. I don't know when he became a decision maker, but it certainly wasn't in my mind, whose team generated predictions that informed ministers about what strategies they might take. Now, it seemed that the team was being wildly pessimistic, but, better to be pessimistic. I'm not blaming him for that. It is better to be pessimistic and not have things turn out as bad as you predicted than the other way round. Where are we? The media are presenting the scientists as decision makers when they're not. We're in the front line when we shouldn't be. No, you're giving advice based on the figures you say are right. You have to take responsibility for that, even though the government is ultimately the body responsible for acting on your recommendations. We are not the story. Oh, yes, you are, the advisor said. They're not giving names here at all, are they? Unlike the government's chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, and the chief medical officer, Professor Chris Whitty, the independent university academics who sit on SAGE do not have teams to manage their media appearances and support them. Well, I do not see why they should think a team would be necessary anyway. Okay, another scientist advising government. So again, sloppy reporting, one way or the other. Are you remaining anonymous, or is the reporter not just bothering to get your name straight? Another scientist advising government on the coronavirus outbreak was furious at how Ferguson had been treated. In what way has he been treated? He said certain rules should apply to everyone and then decided they weren't going to apply to him. And everybody was a little bit amused by that. I don't see any particular treatment. So far as I know, nobody's been throwing rocks through his window or even milkshaking him for that. How Ferguson had been treated. We weren't bowing and scraping sufficiently, perhaps. And said SAGE had lost a dedicated, hard-working and world-class scientist. Well, there are other dedicated, world-class scientists in this country. Thank God Britain has a plethora of good scientists. I absolutely do not think it was a resigning situation. Don't you now? He doesn't work for the government. Yeah, but he is on SAGE. He doesn't make policy. He's a scientist who works for a university, and he spends hours and hours on these committees because it's the right thing to do. He made a mistake. We all make mistakes. Well, Mr. Maybe even Sir, another scientist, whoever you are. Making a mistake is when you let a pot boil dry on the stove. Making a mistake involves calling your wife by your mistress's name. Making a mistake involves drinking that last bit of tomato juice out of the bottle without realizing or checking that it's been in the fridge for 3 months. That's making a mistake. Inviting your girlfriend over to spend the night in your flat, that's not a mistake. I mean, I know all about absent-minded professors, but even absent-minded professors don't make that sort of mistake. And believe me, I've watched a mathematician pour tea into a sugar basin and then drink it. Inviting your girlfriend to your flat, that's a planned action, not a mistake. People have called Professor Ferguson a hypocrite for this because he advised the government to shut down the country on the grounds that the NHS wouldn't be able to manage the sudden avalanche of patients pouring through their doors, all with their lungs turning to cement as they watched. Yeah, I don't think Ferguson was wrong. You know, the UK did need some breathing space, so to speak, to get the equipment and for the sclerotic National Health Service to creak and groan into action like the senescent old senior citizen that it is. However, now that we know what we're facing and now that we have strategies in place, people are becoming restive. And so when they see one of the main causes of the lockdown caught quite literally with his pants down, well, look, Professor Ferguson was on SAGE. It's a great honour to be invited to join such a committee, and it doesn't do your career any harm. Well, unless you get caught flouting the rules you yourself fought for, of course. And, you know, he wasn't paid, as the other scientist pointed out. He wasn't paid for sitting on this committee. But, you know, being on such a committee would help enormously with the lecture tours, with the visiting professorships, with the promotion prospects, and even with the publications. Because after all, what reviewer is going to reject a paper written by a SAGE scientist? So in the end, being on SAGE, while not lucrative in itself, is still probably something of a goldmine. And when the public finds that one of their movers and shakers has been caught, well, with one hand basically in the till, while the other is desperately grabbing for a towel to cover his modesty, well, what's left of it at any rate, well, it's only natural that we should indulge in a little sadistic glee. And there's nothing unfair about that. So much of the press has joined the merry throng in calling him a hypocrite. But actually, well, let's look at this logically. I agree with the Schadenfreude. It's entirely reasonable considering the circumstances, but I am sorry to have to say this, but the man isn't a hypocrite. The term hypocrisy is more descriptive of the press, who've been savaging him with childish glee and writing descriptions of his activities, never failing to use the words married lover somewhere in the article, as if most of them wouldn't like to grab such a stunningly beautiful woman for themselves if they could. Oh, yeah, I happen to think that adultery is wrong, but I'm not discussing that here. Whether his paramour was married or not, the fact is that Professor Ferguson broke the rules which he himself set up. And that's all we should be talking about, because it stems from something else other than hypocrisy. Professor Ferguson did what he did because he knew there wasn't any chance of contagion. I've read that both of the parties had recovered from COVID-19, which makes both of them immune. And so there was no chance of them infecting each other or anyone else. Now, I don't know whether both of them were. If the woman was not immune, then she would have been crossing London. But no doubt Professor Ferguson had the idea that she would take proper precautions, and this is what I'm talking about. So it doesn't make any difference whether they were both or one of them was immune. You see, Ferguson knew that he could make an informed decision about his behaviour based on his knowledge and his sense that he was being socially responsible, or his woman friend was being socially responsible, or they both were. What everybody, me included, what we're all angry about is that he didn't trust anyone else to make that decision apart from himself and his girlfriend. This attitude comes from a particular mindset which you see here in the Guardian article as well, in which it's taken for granted that well-educated university graduates know how the world should be, but all the rest, the oiks, do not. And if they just dare to voice an opinion contrary to the opinions of the aforementioned gods of behaviour, then they're not only oiks, but objectionable oiks into the bargain, and probably dangerously objectionable oiks. What we're annoyed about is not that Professor Ferguson had a girlfriend, married or not, but that he believed that by virtue of his superior intellect, he was not only immune from this coronavirus, but also from the rules that apply to everyone else. If you want to donate or contact, the information will be rolling over the Graniopteryx as I speak. Please like, subscribe and share because it does help with the algorithm. If you visit my channel on YouTube and one day discover that I've disappeared without warning, you'll still find me on BitChute or Minds. Just go to either of those platforms and do a search for Graniopteryx. If you're already watching this on BitChute or Minds, good for you. Meanwhile, if you're watching this on YouTube, remember that you must keep checking the subscribe and bell icons because occasionally they reset. Till next time.